On the 6th of March 1945, at 4:30 in the morning, the guns of Hitler's last Panzer Army opened up in the dark over western Hungary. These were not ordinary soldiers. This was the 6th SS Panzer Army, the same force that had spearheaded the Battle of the Bulge 3 months before. 10 days later, it was finished as a fighting force. And by April, Hitler had handed its proudest division an order so shameful that its own general refused to read it out. That order is where this ends. Start with what the army was. The whole story turns on how good it was supposed to be. In the spring of 1945, the 6th SS Panzer Army was the best Germany had left. Its heart was the Leibstandarte, the division raised in the 1930s as Hitler's personal bodyguard. Beside it stood the Hitler Youth Division. These were boys, filled up with the war and nothing else. The regime trusted these men most and armed them first. 3 months earlier, in the Ardennes, these same divisions had led the great surprise attack the world remembers as the Battle of the Bulge. That attack failed on the thing an army needs most. The spearhead of the Leibstandarte was a battle group under a colonel named Joachim Peiper. It drove deep into the American lines. Then it ran out of gasoline. Trapped in the villages of La Glaise and Stoumont with dry tanks, Peiper's men blew up their vehicles and walked back to German lines on foot in the snow. The most feared armoured force in the West had been beaten by an empty fuel tank. Hitler did not disband the army after that. He pulled it out of the West, refitted it, and pointed it at the far side of Europe. He was about to send an army that had just died for lack of fuel on a mission to go and capture some. The mission was oil. By the start of 1945, Germany was running dry. Allied bombers had smashed the synthetic fuel plants to rubble. The Romanian oil fields were long gone, taken by the Red Army the summer before. One place still pumped crude in any quantity. It was a stretch of ground in western Hungary, around a long, shallow lake called Balaton, with a refinery complex near a town called Nagy Kanisa. By now, it was not much. What sat near Balaton was the last of it. Hitler had lost the war in every direction at once. But he fixed on that Hungarian oil the way a drowning man fixes on a floating plank. His own senior officers wanted the panzers held back to defend Berlin. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from the east. Hitler overruled them all and sent his best army south instead. One general argued that you could not run a mechanized army on the promise of fuel it did not yet have. Hitler snapped back at him. "You want to attack without oil," he said. "Good. We will see what happens." Alfred Jodl, one of his own staff chiefs, wrote the exchange down after the war. The move east was run like a smuggling job. Every unit got a false cover name. License plates were covered over. Divisional badges came off the vehicles. The tanks moved only at night. Radio silence was ordered on pain of death. The Leibstandarte was even told to take off its cuff titles, the black cloth bands stitched in silver thread with Hitler's own name. Those bands marked its men out as his personal division. So they removed his name, to stay hidden from Soviet scouts. It would not be the last time that division was ordered to take it off. Then there was the ground. And the ground decided the battle before a single German tank fired a shot. March in Hungary is the thaw. All winter the frost had held the fields hard enough to drive a 70-ton tank across. In early March the temperature climbed. The rain came. The frozen soil turned into a deep grey mud that pulled the tracks down and would not let go. Lake Balaton was still packed with drifting ice, which wrecked a German plan to ferry troops across it by boat. Only a few paved roads stayed firm. They became the one way forward. Every tank, every fuel truck, every cart of shells was funneled onto that thin network, nose to tail, in the open. The plan was a giant pincer around the lake. The Sixth SS Panzer Army would drive the main blow north of Balaton, aiming east for the Danube. The Second Panzer Army would push from south of the lake. The arms would close on the river and cut the Soviet front in half. It was the kind of sweeping arrow Germany had drawn on the map back in 1941, when it still had the strength to make one real. In 1945, it had the arrow and not the strength. At 4:30 on the 6th of March, the artillery opened along the front. Behind the barrage came the Panzer Grenadiers of the Leibstandarte on foot. They were walking into a defence that a Soviet marshal named Fyodor Tolbukhin had spent weeks building. Tolbukhin commanded the 3rd Ukrainian Front. Soviet intelligence had warned him almost exactly where the blow would land. Every careful German trick with the cover names and the covered plates had been wasted. The enemy already knew they were coming. Tolbukhin did not try to stop the attack at one hard line. He built belt after belt of anti-tank guns, minefields, dug-in infantry and hidden artillery. Some of it ran 20 miles deep. He would let the German armour drive into the teeth of it and bleed. He had more than 460,000 soldiers in the sector and hundreds of guns waiting. And he did something that took real nerve. Moscow had handed him a fresh, full-strength army, the 9th Guards. He was ordered to keep his hands off it, to let it sit behind the fighting while the battle raged, saving it for the counterblow everyone knew was coming. The Germans had committed better than 400,000 men and over 800 tanks and assault guns to the attack. Two huge armies ground into each other in the mud. One of them was holding a knife behind its back. For the first 2 days, it half worked. The attack went in with real fury, the desperate energy of men who had been told this was Germany's last chance. The Hitler Youth Division punched about 10 miles into the Soviet zone by the 8th of March. It tore through the forward belts where the ground was still firm. Then the thaw took command. Off the roads, the tanks began to sink. Germany's newest heavy tank was the King Tiger, nearly 70 tons of it, and in the Hungarian mud that weight turned into its enemy. King Tigers went down to their turrets in the soft ground. A grim joke went around the crews. "We are steering U-boats now," they said, "not tanks." A King Tiger sunk to its turret is not a weapon anymore, just a steel roadblock. Freeing one takes another heavy vehicle and hours of work, if it comes free at all. And the fuel and the shells could not reach the spearheads. The trucks carrying them were trapped behind the same few flooded roads. The army sent to capture oil was being stopped, in part, by the lack of fuel to move. By the 12th of March, the leading German units reached a waterline called the Sió Canal, a channel roughly 100 feet across. Here, the attack broke its teeth. The Hitler Youth Division pushed assault boats and support tanks at the far bank. It ran into a wall of Soviet anti-tank fire that drove the tanks back off the water and cut the crossing apart. The Leibstandarte managed a little more. It forced a small foothold on the far side where engineers threw a bridge across for the tanks. The second vehicle onto it was too heavy. The bridge came down. The crossing turned into a slow, desperate grind of repair under fire. A few miles from that canal, near a town called Sixth SS, the offensive ran into one Red Army sergeant. His name was Pavel Papin. He held a strong point with a single platoon. 40 German tanks and their infantry came at his position across open ground. Papin's platoon threw back the first attack, then a second, and held through a third and a fourth. On the fifth, the ammunition was nearly gone, and a tank was grinding straight for his position. Papin took an anti-tank grenade. He went in under the lead tank's tracks and stopped it there. He did not come back. His platoon held the ground. That summer, his country made him a hero of the Soviet Union. This was the wall the elite of the German army spent itself against. One gun crew and one sergeant at a time. Men who feared nothing the SS could bring and hated everything it stood for. And behind them, belt after belt of the same. Be plain about who was doing the attacking here. The Leibstandarte was not a normal fighting unit that happened to wear a different badge. This was the division whose men, 3 months earlier in the Ardennes, had shot 84 unarmed American prisoners in a field at Malmedy. The colonel who led that spearhead, Joachim Pieper, was here too. He commanded the Leibstandarte's tank regiment, sitting in the same Hungarian mud that was swallowing his king tigers. And a little to the south, in the same offensive, fought the Totenkopf division. It had a darker beginning than any of them. Before the war, it had been raised out of the men who guarded the concentration camps. It wore a death's head as its emblem because that is what those men had been. These were the troops the regime called its finest and most loyal. Every Red Army soldier waiting in the mud understood their record in full. So when a Soviet gun crew held its ground in front of these men, there was a great deal more riding on it than a line on a map. There was payback in it. The southern half of the pincer did no better. The Second Panzer Army attacked below the lake under General Maximilian de Angelis. It ground a short distance into the same mud and the same anti-tank belts and stalled almost at once. The two arms that were meant to close on the Danube never came within reach of each other. Each stuck fast in its own patch of flooded ground, miles apart, with the Soviet front unbroken between them. The German attack died on the 15th of March. It was stuck in the mud, short of every objective it had been given. At its very deepest point, It had gained maybe 18 miles of Hungarian farmland. It had reached nothing that mattered. The Danube was still far ahead. On the 16th of March, the day after the German attack stalled, Tolbukhin swung his fist. The Soviet counteroffensive opened north of the German wedge. The fresh 9th Guards Army, the one held back all this time, led it. It drove straight for the base of the salient the Germans had just spent 10 days pushing out. The Soviet plan was simple and deadly. Pinch off the neck of the Bulge and trap the whole 6th SS Panzer Army inside it. Inside that closing pocket, the German command came close to losing its army altogether. Hitler's standing rule was absolute. Ground was never given up, and a unit held its place or died in it. Obeying that rule now meant walking the whole army into the Soviet jaws. One SS General, Karl Ulrich of the Viking Division, watched the trap forming. He pulled his men back before the order ever came. That is very likely the only reason his division escaped in one piece. Ulrich obeyed the ground instead of the map, and the ground said, "Run." Other commanders did the same, quietly, without waiting for a headquarters that was still shouting at them to stand. The withdrawal turned into a scramble for the few exits still open. Behind them, the Soviet pincers kept narrowing. This was not clean or cheap for the Red Army. Breaking the German attack, then driving it back and lunging for Vienna, cost Tolbukhin's front dearly through late March and into April. The counterstroke and the pursuit ran up tens of thousands of Soviet casualties. This was a brutal, close fight against desperate men who knew what surrender to the east would mean and fought with a fanatical edge because of it. But the Red Army had numbers and fuel and firm ground under its own guns, and the Germans had none of those things left. Panzer divisions that had massed more than 800 tanks and assault guns for this offensive simply came apart. The ISS Panzer Corps was the mailed fist at the centre of the whole plan. By the 20th of March, it could put only 80 running tanks and guns into the field. 80. Everything else was destroyed in action, broken down, out of fuel, or sunk to the turret in the mud where the exhausted crews finally left it. The bill for those 10 days ran past 12,000 casualties in the attacking army group alone. Spent for a strip of muddy farmland the Germans could not hold for a single week. Somebody had to answer for it. Otto Wöhler, the general commanding the whole army group, was relieved of his command in late March and replaced. It made no difference on the ground. The 6th SS Panzer Army fell back across Hungary with Tolbukhin's front pressing on its heels the whole way. By the 30th of March, Soviet troops crossed out of Hungary and into Austria. Within days, the same army that had opened the year as Hitler's sharpest weapon was scraping shallow defensive lines together outside Vienna. It was no longer an attacking force at all, just exhausted men bracing for the next Soviet push. The oil fields around Nagykanissa, the whole reason the army had been sent south, fell to the Red Army in the first days of April. The offensive had not just failed, it had thrown away the last mobile reserve Germany owned and gained nothing for it. The way it was thrown away is the part worth sitting with. Most of that armour was not shot to pieces in some grand tank duel. It was simply left behind. Vehicles that ran dry or bolted to the hull, were abandoned by their crews right where they stopped. Many were still in working order. They needed nothing but fuel and firm ground, and neither existed. Soviet troops advancing over that same ground counted well over 180 German armoured vehicles left intact in the mud of this one battle and its aftermath. King Tigers, Panthers, the most expensive, hardest to build machines in the German army. Tanks that took a factory months to make and that Germany by 1945 could no longer replace at all. They were handed to the enemy for the price of an empty gas tank. The Red Army had spent years learning to fight this exact army. Now it got to walk up and inspect it at leisure. What was left of the Sixth SS Panzer Army kept moving west. Out of Hungary, back through Austria, fighting delaying actions the whole way, as the Soviet drive rolled toward Vienna and then past it. Hitler's hammer spent its last weeks as a rear guard. It traded ground for time it no longer had any use for. When the end came in early May, its surviving men did not surrender to the Soviets they had fought at Balaton. They marched west and gave themselves up to the Americans instead. They gambled that captivity in the west would be softer than whatever waited for the SS in the east. They were probably right. The men who had guarded the camps and the division that had shot prisoners at Malmedy understood exactly what they had earned in the east. In April, the cuff titles came back. The reports reached Hitler that his SS divisions had failed, that the Leibstandarte itself had given ground. He did not blame the mud that had swallowed his tanks. He blamed the men. He sent an order down. The Waffen SS divisions in Hungary were to remove their cuff titles, the same silver-stitched bands with his own name on them, the ones they had worn as the highest honour in his army. Back in January, they had taken the name off to hide. Now they were told to take it off in disgrace. A public mark that they had shamed their Führer. The division raised to be Hitler's personal bodyguard was ordered to strip his name off its sleeve like a punishment. And Sepp Dietrich, the general who had followed Hitler from the earliest street fighting days, read that order and refused to pass it to his men. He would not do it to them. After everything they had spent in the mud at Balaton, he saw no honour left in it. He let the order die on his desk. That is how Hitler's last Panzer Army ended its war. There was no vast encirclement, no cauldron closing on it with the world watching. It was bled white in the Hungarian thaw in 10 days, and then ordered by the man it had guarded to tear his name off its own uniforms. The King Tigers the crews had joked about, the ones sunk to their turrets in the grey mud, were still sitting out in the fields when the Red Army rolled past them toward Vienna. In the end, the ground beat these men before the enemy ever did. The Red Army finished what the mud had started. And the deepest cut of all came from Berlin, from the one man they had been raised to protect.